Hey folks, it's Skeptical Linguist Bible Studies, episode 2, Genesis 2. Hope you like my glasses. Hey, so when I was researching this, I thought that it was going to be quick and easy. Genesis 2 is always kind of glossed over, and there's kind of a contradiction that answers in Genesis would, of course, have a perfectly good explanation for. And that would be about it. Well, it took me over 30 hours of research. There's a lot going on in this chapter, so buckle in. I say all that to say, if you want to help support this channel, I would appreciate it. I now understand why so many YouTubers are so big into Patreon. 30 hours of research is no joke. So, let's get into it. We're going to actually be doing our very best to read directly from the Hebrew. Here's verse 1. Thus were finished the heavens and the earth and all the host of them. The heavens, again, from Genesis 1, that still means the sky. And there's a question about the host of them. Of course, the heavens and the earth are only two things. So the host of them, what does that mean? It's not a big deal here. The best modern English translation that I can come up with is basically that it says, so that's how the sky and the earth and all that stuff got formed. Verse 2, and God ended on the seventh day his work which he had done, and he rested on the seventh day from all his work which he had done. Okay, malakto is his work, vaishbot, and he rested. The word has the root word shavath, from which we also get Shabbat, Sabbath, the day of rest. And another translation is to cease. So he ceased working. The thing is, they're connected with the conjunction for and. And that means that it's connecting two separate thoughts. So, God stopped working on the seventh day, and something else. So, if it means cease, then they wouldn't use the conjunction and as if it was a separate thought. So we have to say that God rested. That is the only sensible translation. The problem being, of course, if God is omnipotent, that means he has an unlimited reserve of energy. If God has an unlimited reserve of energy, there is no need for rest. The Bible does seem to indicate that God is omnipotent. He's called Almighty 74 times. I looked that up. Matthew 19:26 says, with God all things are possible. Genesis 18:14 implies that nothing is too difficult for God. And Luke 1:37 says nothing is impossible with God. So it seems to indicate that he is, in fact, omnipotent, but also he rested. Was he tuckered out? I'm just asking questions, not necessarily here to pontificate and tell you everything as some sort of expert. I have a limited degree of expertise in linguistics, but if there's better explanations, please let me know. Write, maybe you can be on a call on the show, or I can read your comments on the next show. That would be good. So, moving on. God, even though he's omnipotent, had to take a break. Not quite getting that. So, next verse. And God blessed the seventh day, and he sanctified it, because in it he rested from all the work which God had created and accomplished. Vaybarach, and blessed. This means to bless, to thank, or to kneel, or to sanctify. This is basically conferring an attribute to something when God does it. Think of it as the exact opposite of a curse in a magical tale. When somebody curses something, they make bad things happen to it. When you bless something, the opposite happens, right? So God's making something special, set apart, better about that seventh day, the Sabbath, Saturday. Vaykadesh is, and he sanctified, which means to set apart, make holy. He was commemorating the day he stopped working. This is a commemoration. La'asot means accomplished. It's kind of weird to say that all the work he'd done and accomplished. It's kind of meh wording. Okay, verse 4.
אלה תולדות השמיים והארץ בהיברעם ביום עשות אדוני אלוהים ארץ ושמיים.
So, these are the generations of the heavens and earth when they were created in the day that Yahweh God made the earth and the heavens. Okay. Generations number 1, real quick, is account, history. So, this is the history of the heavens and the earth in the days that Yahweh God made them. It's Yahweh time, folks. Told you it was coming up. Now, when you hear this read, as you did a minute ago, and when it's spoken by Jews, Jews are forbidden to say Yahweh, because it's just too holy to say out loud. So, even though the word is actually Yahweh, they read it as Adonai, but it's there. I learned that. I did not realize that they were not reading the thing that was actually there. That's interesting. Here's the problem with Yahweh, and this is one of the things that made this such a blast researching. Yahweh does seem to have been, at one point, the name of a Canaanite deity. Not a Hebrew deity, a Canaanite deity. Now, this presents some problems if the Hebrews were in Israel and got taken to Egypt and came back and fought the Canaanites, like the Bible says, using their God Yahweh to overthrow their pantheon, because Yahweh was in the Canaanite pantheon. So, what's going on here? Let's talk about the Canaanite pantheon first. So the Canaanite pantheon was headed up by El, a god named El. That'll be interesting in a minute. The word Eloah means deity. Elohim, as God is referred to, means deities, or the royal plural deity, as in we are not amused. So, this is identifying the creator God as Yahweh. Like I said, Canaanites believed in El as the head of the pantheon, and Yahweh as the god of either metallurgy or war, depending on who you ask when. So, one clue is in the word Israel itself, Israel, which is the name given to Jacob in the Bible after he wrestled with God. He was given that name because he struggled with God. Israel means to have struggled or struggled with God. The root Sarah means to contend, and El means God. So Israel means to contend with God. Or maybe it means seeing El, God, or it means may El prevail, depending on who you ask. But in the Bible, it was the children of Israel fighting the Canaanites. There's this carving I found from around between 750 and 700 BC, which probably means something like this. Uriyahu the rich wrote it. Blessed be Uriyahu by Yahweh, for from his enemies by his, Yahweh's, Asherah, he saved him. Asherah means mother goddess. And Asherah was the wife of El in the Canaanite pantheon. You had El married to Asherah, and they apparently cosmically banged and had Yahweh as a kid. So, we do have Yahweh having a mother goddess, There's also a curious case in Deuteronomy 33, verse 2 as well, with what appears to be Asherah at Yahweh's right hand. If you look it up in Strong's Concordance, you'll see that the word is just blanked out. They do not translate that word. The word is a feminine noun, and they utterly drop it for some reason, and translate the phrase as a law of fire, which is kind of a mysterious and meaningless phrase, as far as I can tell so far. So again, who came first, Hebrew Yahweh or Canaanite Yahweh? There's lots of theories about this stuff, and it goes all over the place, and there's lots of unsubstantiated claims made, but ultimately, here's the problem. A lot of this really depends on who wrote the Pentateuch. That's the first 5 books of the Bible: Genesis, Exodus, Numbers, Leviticus, Deuteronomy. The Bible claims, well, Christians and Jews claim that it was written by Moses, but there's no way to prove that, and there's a couple of problems with that. First off, Moses supposedly lived over 1,000 years before Hebrew writing was first on the scene. Here's a comparison of the earliest alphabets, and you'll see that there's some very serious similarities between Canaanite, which is the Assyrian and the Phoenician, and the Hebrew. So it seems, and this is the linguist consensus, Hebrews were an offshoot of the Canaanites. They didn't come to Canaan as invaders. They were just a subset of Canaanites. That would really help make sense of why there are so many words that are similar, why there are so many crossovers with the deities going on, and it also kind of throws a monkey wrench into the traditional Judeo-Christian interpretation of the history there, the Exodus and all of that stuff. So there's a couple different theories, again, about who wrote the Pentateuch. Of course, the first theory is that Moses wrote it. That's what Jewish scholars believe, Christians believe. But Moses wasn't writing stuff down, at least not in Hebrew. So the original Hebrew couldn't have come before there was Hebrew writing. That was long after Moses was off the scene, assuming any of this really happened. In Ancient Israel by Lester L. Grob, page 117, it says, there were no pre-8th century alphabetic writings in the area of Israel and Judah, except for the Gezer calendar, which was probably Canaanite or early Hebrew. Early Hebrew and Canaanite writings being very difficult to distinguish. The spread of alphabetic writing did not antedate the mid-8th century, and not a single inscription has been found in Jerusalem before the late 8th century. There's another theory called the documentary hypothesis. And the hypothesis says that writers from between 900 and 850 BC gathered the myths of Babylon, like the Epic of Gilgamesh for Noah's flood, and then these things became oral traditions that eventually got written down 1,000 to 1,500 years after Moses died. Now, writers from 750 to 700 BC or so, the Elohists, these are the folks that referred to God as Elohim. Now, this theory says that there are different authors for different passages in Genesis. That would make sense of why, in Genesis chapter 1, you have an account of Elohim doing this stuff, and in Genesis 2, you have Yahweh Elohim doing this stuff. So, Deuteronomists, the folks that simply wrote Deuteronomy, of course, all of Deuteronomy couldn't have been written by Moses because Moses dies in Deuteronomy, and I don't think he would have been around to write about it. So they say that it was Joshua who did that. There's no evidence for Joshua having written any of it, but that is what they say. Priestly sources then took all that stuff, and editors cobbled it all together into a steaming, crazy jumble of. So, why do I say all this? I say all this to say that even if the Hebrews came back from Egypt and conquered Canaan, one of the later interpretations of Yahweh from the Canaanites' point of view was as a god of war. Now, what were the Hebrews doing? They were conquering. So, when they were talking about a god of war, they were talking, in terms the Canaanites would understand about a Yahweh. Then, having conquered became the supreme deity, and then later on in Isaiah or so, the only deity. These things change over time. Languages fuse, religions fuse, ideas cross over. There's no hell and then there's a hell. These things happen. That is the evolution of religion and language. Yahweh in these verses might have been there originally, written by Moses in texts that don't exist, written in some other language that there's no evidence for, and they got translated into Hebrew later. That would make the Hebrew not the original texts. No evidence for that one. Probably didn't happen. A lot of these people weren't even literate in the first place. Also, carrying around tons of clay stone tablets through the desert would have kind of been a drag. Maybe even literally. Yahweh in these verses might have been there originally, but maybe these verses weren't written until over 1,000 years after the events of Exodus supposedly happened. So originally means after all the syncretism happened. Or a third option, Moses wrote the verses himself in Hebrew, and all the scholars are wrong, and Hebrew was the very first language and alphabet that existed, and there's no evidence for any of that. So that's the third theory. Personally, I think the most sensible theory is that these verses were written long after any supposed Moses happened, in Hebrew, after Yahweh became part of the Hebrew religion. So, back to verse 4. These are the generations of the heavens and the earth when they were created in the day that Yahweh, God, made the earth and the heavens. Verse 5. Basically, there was no plant life yet because God had not made it rain yet, and man didn't exist yet to cultivate the ground. Here's the big hullabaloo. If you remember Genesis 1, plants were created on day 3. Man was created on day 6. So, if God wasn't making plants yet because humans weren't around to cultivate them, in this chapter, is that not a contradiction with Genesis 1? Answers in Genesis is ready to jump all over me, and we'll get to them, but let's get through some more first. So a lot of people try to get around this by saying, well, in Genesis 1, God put the seeds in the earth and provided the potential for the plants, but didn't have them sprout yet. Well, unfortunately, the word here is to sprout, to shoot, to show green. So, if God created just the seeds, he wouldn't have been creating plants that bear seeds. He would have been creating seeds, not plants. And the word let bring forth would not have been used because it wouldn't have been brought forth. It would have just been in there. So, this does appear to be a contradiction. Again, Answers in Genesis is just champing at the bits. They want to get at me over this. And we will get to them, I promise. Calm down, guys. Hold your horses. Verse 6, but a mist went up from the earth and watered the whole face of the ground. A mist went up from the earth and watered the whole ground that way, so we don't need to worry about rain. So, is this radiation fog? Quick weather lesson. Warm air and cool air can contain different amounts of water. That's what humidity is. At 100% humidity, the air is saturated. When the air is saturated, you get haze or fog. So, what happens in the daytime is the air gets all this moisture in it, but it doesn't show it. That's because hotter air can hold more water in it. And then when temperatures drop and the moisture in the air remains the same, you start seeing water condense on plants. And that's dew. The air is saturated. The water in the air is now visible at that point. So haze or fog. The air itself is wet. The way that it works, as far as we know, is water evaporates from the surface of the earth into the air. Air is hotter toward the bottom of the earth, and hot air rises. So as hot, moist air rises, it cools, and the water in that cooling, rising air condenses, and that's what makes clouds. Eventually it rains, but if it hadn't rained yet, what was happening with the evaporating water? Where was the water evaporating to? Why didn't the hot air rise? It seems like what it's saying is there were clouds that were just kind of sticking close to the surface of the earth without rising into our atmosphere somehow and turning into clouds. But why not? Did hot air not used to rise? Or, just a thought, was this written by people who didn't understand meteorology and they got some stuff wrong? Possibility, right? Never. So, either they were just totally making this stuff up, they were, or things really did used to work differently. They didn't. Hot, moist air rises and becomes cloud. Apparently, this wasn't happening, though. Okay, so, linguistically, just a couple interesting words. Vehishka, and was giving to drink to cause to drink water. Adama means the ground. We can understand ground and earth as being the same thing. There's no problem there. Just wanted to point it out in case people were wondering about those words. Verse 7. And Yahweh God formed man from the dust of the ground and breathed into his nostrils the breath of life, and the man became a living being. Vayiser, to form in the fashion of a potter. Ha-Adam, of human man. Afar means from the dry earth. Vayipha, to blow into, inflate. Nishmat is the interesting one here. Breath and spirit were considered the same thing back in the day in some cultures. So a lot of people think that when the final breath leaves the body, that's the spirit exiting the body. Some translations don't say this was the breath of life. They say it was the spirit of life. But there's a different word that's more commonly used for spirit. And we have blowing into nostrils. That is physical. So one would expect that if you're blowing something into nostrils, you're doing something physical. So, whatever God blew into his nostrils physically was also somehow spiritual. Here's the thing, animals also breathe. Do they have the breath of life? God didn't blow into dogs' noses, though, did he? Well, Genesis 1 says animals have souls, but apparently this was written by somebody else. Maybe. This is why Jews, by the way, believe that life begins at first breath, because when breath happened, that's when man becomes alive. And that's why Jews don't oppose abortion, because you're kind of under construction and not alive until you take your first breath. So that's where that idea comes from. It's too bad, by the way, their religious liberty is under attack by people who also believe in the Bible. So here's how I interpret this so far. So that's how the sky and the earth and all that stuff got here, and God stopped working on the seventh day and rested from all the work he'd done and accomplished. There was no plant life yet because God had not yet made it rain. And man didn't exist to cultivate the ground because there was no reason to make plant life without humans around to work it. But there was radiation fog, and hot air didn't rise to become clouds, so that's how stuff got watered. And Yahweh took some dust like a potter and formed a man out of it and blew the breath of life into his nostrils, and the man came alive. Again, this is confusing. Other animals breathe, and God didn't blow into their nostrils, so the breath of life is something spiritual that is conveyed physically from one physical being, apparently, into another. But God is not physical. Or maybe he is now, and later he becomes the spirit and corporal. Verse 8. And Yahweh, God planted a garden in Eden in the east, and he put there the man whom he had formed. Now, planted. Interesting, vayita. It's a different verb than the one in Genesis 1 that means to sprout. Keep an eye on that when we get to the answers in Genesis stuff. It's coming, guys. This means what we mean when we say to plant. So, to put seeds into the ground. So God planted the seeds in the ground. Garden means what it means in English. Eden is a region in the east. Interesting. East of where? It's possible, actually, that the word east here doesn't mean east. It also is used to refer to antiquity, olden times, and that sort of thing. So there's two ways to translate that word east. Verse 9. And Yahweh God made to grow every tree that is pleasing to the sight out of the ground and is good for food. And the tree of life was in the garden, and the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Okay, let's start this one out. And made grow. Okay, he planted and made it to grow. Very different verbiage than Genesis 1. Again, it's kind of looking like two different authors here. He didn't just plant them, he made to grow too. And that happened now that man was around, unlike in Genesis 1. By the way, it should just go without saying none of this is borne out by the biological record. We know that there were plants before there were man. That is abundantly clear, folks. But hey, so the tree of life. The words here refer to the tree of life as an actual tree. That is an actual tree that gave the people who ate the fruit immortality permanently. That's one interpretation. Another interpretation is an actual tree, the fruit of which miraculously prevented aging, but you had to keep eating it. In Kabbalah, the tree of life is a pictorial representation of how the universe came into being and spiritual states of humans. At the top is Keter, the primordial energy that everything is made out of. Then you've got Chokmah, wisdom, and that also represents the expansion of a singularity. Interesting that that sort of echoes what we know about cosmology. Da'at is knowledge, by the way. So, Kabbalists believe that we humans are products of the tree of life. We got here into Malkuth by the process of creation, and we start out there, and it's our job to ascend back up the tree, very similar to what is believed in Kundalini Yoga. And that's interesting, because we will see when Moses healed the sick people with a stick, more similarities to Kundalini Yoga. So we'll discuss more about what this was and or what it symbolized later on as more points come up. The tree of the knowledge of good and evil, what is that? Again, the language is talking about a literal tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Da'at, as I said above, is one of the Kabbalah nodes. And this means mind, knowledge, reason, sense. Good means what it means in English. Evil, vara. Again, what it means in English. Evil, bad, wrong, cruelty, so on and so forth. So, right and wrong. The tree of the knowledge of right and wrong, good and evil. Now, coming up later, we will see God puts the tree in the garden and says, don't eat it. But if they don't know what's wrong, then they're not created in the likeness of God in a moral way, from Genesis 1, because God knows good from evil and they don't. So, in the image of God can no longer mean in a moral way. God knows good from evil, they don't. If you don't have the knowledge of good and evil, the likeness cannot be moral. Cannot be related to morality, right? Also, kind of a sticking point here, logically, since they don't know right from wrong, how do they know that disobedience is bad? Moving on to verse 10. Now a river went out of Eden to water the garden, and from there it parted and became 4 headwaters. The name of the first is Pison, some people pronounce it. It winds through the whole land of Havilah. There is gold. Now, let's stop here. Nobody's quite sure where this is, and I spent a while trying to figure it out, and came to all sorts of crazy conclusions all over the place. Some scholars think that it was the Nile. The Nile, of course, doesn't intersect the other rivers, although maybe the ancient geography was different. That's what Answers in Genesis would say, of course. Others think it's the Ganges down into India, and maybe Nubia, the land of Cush, was known as a source of gold and onyx, though. I guess India has that stuff too, but not in the same way as Nubia. Again, none of these intersect the Tigris or the Euphrates River, which are also identified. What's interesting here, though, is Genesis 10 says Havilah was a son of Cush, and Cush kind of set up camp in Ethiopia. So that's more points for Nubia. We'll see in a minute that doesn't work, but the land of Havilah, nobody's sure where this is either. Guesses, of course, include Ethiopia, the Arabian Desert, modern-day Jordan, I saw in one case, the Philippines, somehow. There's a place in the Khartoum region of Sudan called Havilah, but the Nile is, again, very far away from the Tigris and Euphrates. At least it is now. There's also stuff about possible ancient riverbeds that formed visible canyons within the Mediterranean and the Black Seas. So there was a point at which I guess the Mediterranean was almost dry, and there were rivers flowing through where the Mediterranean is now. The stuff about what the rivers are and where the lands are, just look it up sometime. No two people seem to agree, so I gave up trying after quite a few hours, getting the lay of the land and understanding that this is all just conjecture. But for now, we can just say that maybe the geography was different and there's nothing wrong going on here. Also, by the way, there's a possibility that the Pison is the Indus River. And there is a city called Havelian, Pakistan, that kind of sounds like Havilah. Maybe. So the million-dollar question, though, is the garden was sealed off. The rivers disappeared. There were angels guarding the garden. Nobody's allowed back in the garden. So why give directions to where it was? What is this passage for? Especially if the rivers are just going to disappear, there's no possible reason to give us such detailed directions to a place that doesn't exist anymore. Kind of interrupts the flow of the story too a little bit, don't you think? Verse 12. And the gold of that land is good, and there is bdellium and the onyx stone. What is bdellium? Gum resin? Amber? Pearls? This is another thing nobody quite knows for sure. A lot of people think it's an aromatic resin. Let's do verses 13 and 14. And the name of the second river is Gihon, and it winds through the whole land of Cush. Oh, Cush! Well, there goes the Pison being the Nile, because the one river that winds through Cush is the Nile. Verse 14, and the name of the third river is the Tigris. Now, it's actually not, it's called Hiddekel. It runs along the east side of Assyria. What river runs along the east side of where Assyria was? That's the Tigris. So they translate it as the Tigris, and everybody kind of agrees that that's what it was. And the name of the fourth river is the Euphrates. Again, we know the land of Cush is Ethiopia. The Nile winds all the way through Cush, so unless there used to be 2 rivers going through there that also intersected the Tigris and Euphrates at the Garden of Eden in some vastly different geological setup. Really, when we're going through this stuff, all bets are off. Everything's different now, and we know where the Tigris and Euphrates rivers are. At some point, I guess, the Tigris and Euphrates intersected with the Nile, and, maybe. And, they're very far apart now, but maybe. And either the Indus or the Ganges or some other river that doesn't exist anymore, but used to. Verse 15. And Yahweh God took the man and put him in the garden of Eden to tend and keep it. To tend. This word means to cultivate. It's interesting that it would need cultivation. This might sound like a stretch to some of the biblical folks here, but cultivation and tending kind of imply that weeds are growing or that plants needed help to grow naturally when God had already supernaturally made them grow, and there's no sin, so there's no decay or imperfection in the world at all. So even, I guess, God's perfect work still needs some help from humans, to tend and keep it, to preserve it, to keep up the place. Again, decay? What's going on there? It's just a question. Verse 16. And God commanded the man, saying, you may eat freely of every tree of the garden, but the tree of the knowledge of good and evil you shall not eat. For in the day that you eat it, you shall surely die. Again, in the day, it doesn't have to be taken literally to mean you'll die on that same day. A lot of people say, well, he didn't die the same day, so God was wrong. Well, it doesn't have to be taken literally. Just like back in my day, it's just a general period of time. If you're going to tell somebody, this is my command, and they don't know that it's wrong to disobey commands, why do you have any expectation that they're going to listen to you? Number 2, why would you put something in the garden the guy's not supposed to eat? If I have kids, I'm not going to leave a landmine in the middle of the floor and just say, now remember, don't step on that. So they don't know any better. Now, what's wrong with knowing what good and bad are? That's another very good question and a common one. What's wrong with knowing what good and bad are? Why is knowledge the enemy? And especially if you're expected to obey on the basis that obedience is good and disobedience is wrong. He must have already had some knowledge of right or wrong, or there's a big plot hole, which it seems there is. Was the knowledge of good and evil some deeper understanding? Something more fundamental? What changed when Adam ate of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil? Well, the first thing that happened is he was ashamed of being naked. I'm jumping ahead a little bit, but was the shame evil and the nakedness good? Or was the shame good and the nakedness was evil? Because nowadays, God don't want us flashing our bits or nothing. The concept of nudity is kind of strange in this context, too, because everything had its bits hanging out. What weird knowledge was this? That all of a sudden, once you have it, you're ashamed of being just like everything around you. What frame of reference did it add? Bizarre. Another problem here, so Adam didn't have a frame of reference for right or wrong, and he also didn't have a frame of reference for death. The Bible says that death came into the world through sin. So when God says he's going to die, what did Adam think that meant? He hadn't experienced death yet. Moving on to verse 18. And Yahweh God said, it is not good that man should be alone. I will make him a suitable helper. I don't know how busy he was at his gardening job, but maybe he was just lonely. Now, Genesis 1 says God created man and women, and the other animals were created male and female, but God didn't think to do that with humans. So, man needs a helper, and what does God do? He makes millions of species and gives Adam more work. All right. You need help, don't you? Let me give you some more work. God would be great in corporate America. Just the ideal boss, right? And Yahweh God formed out of the ground every beast of the field and every bird of the air. Wait a minute. I thought God created that stuff before he created man. Answers in Genesis, knocking at my door. What's up? Now, some translations say had created. So, let's do the answers in Genesis thing. All right. This verb here for created is what is called a consecutive imperfect tense. So, Hebrew, especially ancient Hebrew, they don't do it anymore, but ancient Hebrew works a little bit differently linguistically. Imperfect tense is used to describe a past habitual action or state which is incomplete. So, for instance, was working. That is imperfect. Consecutive imperfect is kind of a Hebrew quirk, and it's a little more complicated. It's sometimes called the narrative case because it's being used to continue a narrative that's incomplete. So you might wonder why so many verses of the Bible begin with words like and or so. And this is why. Say you're connecting two thoughts. Bob listened to the lecture. Bob went home. If you connect them, you would say Bob went to the lecture and he went home. And he went, in ancient Hebrew, would become that consecutive imperfect tense. Again, modern Hebrew doesn't do this. It's kind of an old school wording. Anachronistic. Answers in Genesis and biblical literalists insist on using the past perfect tense to translate this. God had formed. And this clears up the confusion. God had formed the animals already and brought them to Adam. I need to kind of spank him a little bit. This would be a sudden departure. Every other time in this passage, there is one of these consecutives. It's connecting to something that happened before it. So this happened, then this happened, then this happened, then this happened, consecutively. Consecutive imperfect. So, if they're right that this should be translated as past perfect, it would be a sudden departure from the style. All the way through, up until that point, then it stops meaning that thing that it's meant, and then goes back to meaning what it meant the rest of the time. We can't prove that it shouldn't be done that way. It's just highly illogical that it would be. Ancient Hebrew, of course, doesn't have a past perfect tense. So if you're going to insist this, it's merely to try to save face. There's no way to prove that that's the right translation, unless you're begging the question. And it doesn't fit in with the usage up to this point. So, the consistent interpretation of the wa consecutive leads us to reasonably assume that these actions follow one another, or God formed new creatures in the garden. Hey, that's another way to escape it. Or these were written by two different people and are two different accounts, as it appears. So let's continue the verse. And he brought them to Adam to see what he would call them. And whatever Adam called each creature, that was its name. Now, there's no linguistic stuff going on here. But here's the problem. Answers in Genesis says, Genesis 1 was an account of the first week. Genesis 2, you zoom in to day 6. All of this stuff happens only on day 6. And God had already created the plants and the animals. So that means Adam named all of the animals in the same day. How did he keep track? I know when I meet somebody and they tell me their name, I forget it 2 seconds later. There's millions and millions and millions of species. And we also, of course, know that many species don't exist everywhere, and speciation happens all around the world, so maybe there were a lot fewer species back then. Or maybe he had an astoundingly good memory. And maybe he was only labeling kinds in the Answers in Genesis sense. And what language was he speaking? And what good did it do to name them? This was time not very well spent because it didn't stick. I mean, cool. He came up with the names for the animals. What a weird job for something that would very quickly change into a million different names, independently of his unwritten register in his mind of millions of terms. Don't really get the point of that. Also, I thought Adam needed a helper. What happened to that? God said, you need a helper. Here's some more work. He's already tending the perfect garden and needed help. But okay, not quite what I had in mind, God. So Adam names all the livestock and the birds of the air and all the beasts of the field. But for Adam was not found a suitable helper. So God said, you need help. I'm going to make a bunch of animals for you to name. Okay, but none of that helped out with his gardening chores, so why did God try that? Did he not know that that wouldn't work? So, next thing's next. Yahweh, God, causes Adam to fall into a deep sleep, and he sleeps, and Yahweh takes one of his ribs and closes up the wound. And God took that rib which he had taken from the man and turned it into a woman and brought it to the man. There's not a lot of linguistic stuff to talk about here, but maybe we can just briefly mention the only thing is ribs. The word used actually means side, but it says one of. So taking one of his side or something from his side, one thing from his side is very clearly rib. So that's why it's commonly understood to mean rib. Whatever. The outrageousness of this, though, is, well, it's outrageous. God made man out of the dust, but making a woman, it's different. He had to use Adam's rib for that. Doing anesthetized surgery? Why? If this is cellular replication going on, God was doing some complicated cellular thing, there's going to be a problem with that because Adam's phenotype was male, so if God was making something out of the rib on a cellular level, Adam's phenotype is going to show up, and it is going to be Adam and Steve. So, that's not what's going on here. The cute explanation about he did it to remind man that woman was meant to be by our side is kind of cringy. Very cringy. Extremely cringy. It's cringy. He already wanted someone by his side, and God already tried unsuccessfully to give him someone by his side by giving him millions of species. And now this? Okay. So, and Adam said, now this is the bone of my bones and the flesh of my flesh. This one shall be called woman because out of man she was taken. Adam was really good at naming stuff, wasn't he? Woman in this is Isha. And man is Is. So Isha means man plus feminine marker. Also, it's nice to see women exist for helping men, and that men are in the leading role and women are in the supporting role. That's a nice patriarchy you got there. Mind if I couple it? Verse 24, therefore a man shall leave his mother and his father and be joined to his wife, and they shall become one flesh. Flesh means what it means in English. Obviously, this is not literal. It's referring to the seriousness of the union. Just as if the woman is made out of you, you want to treat her like your own flesh. It's a cute idea, I suppose. Verse 25, and the two of them were naked, the man and his wife, and they were not ashamed. Now, that's a strong way to end the chapter. Can you imagine being naked with only your pets and not being ashamed of yourself? What purpose does shame serve? We'll see later on that once they knew right from wrong, they were really embarrassed about being naked in front of literally nobody else. So let's review this passage in the best translation that we can come up with. And I will annotate it a little bit. So that's how the sky and the earth and all that stuff got there. And God stopped working on the seventh day and rested from all the work he had done and accomplished. There was no plant life yet because God had not yet made it rain, and man didn't exist yet to cultivate the ground because there was no reason to make plant life without humans around to work it. But there was radiation fog, and hot air didn't rise to become clouds, so that's how that stuff got watered. And Yahweh took some dust and, kind of like a potter, formed a man out of it and blew physically breath into his nostrils, and the man came alive. And God planted a garden in Eden and put the man in the garden, and he made some nice looking trees grow that are good for food, and also the tree of life and the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, for some reason. From the land of Eden there was a river that watered the garden, and from the garden it split into four. The first was Pison, which goes through the entire land of Havilah, where there's really good gold and bdellium and onyx. And the second river was the Nile, which goes through the entire land of Cush. And then there's the Tigris, which goes up by Assyria. And of course, the Euphrates. This information is entirely useless to everyone, and I thought I would include it very specifically anyway, for exactly zero reason. Anyway, so God put the man in that garden at these exact hidden and defunct coordinates and made him to tend the supernaturally perfect garden, which needed human intervention to work right. And God says, hey, you can eat anything from this garden except for one specific tree. If you do eat it, you'll die. Adam had no concept of right or wrong or death, but God did it anyway. So then God says, it's just not right that the man I made is all alone in here. I should make him an assistant. So then he creates animals out of the ground and brings them to Adam and gives him another job instead of an assistant, naming millions of animals and keeping their names straight somehow. So Adam does this all within one day somehow. But wouldn't you know it, he still didn't have a suitable companion. So God anesthetized him and did surgery and took out a rib and turned the rib into a woman. He could have just made her like he did Adam, but he did this to represent how seriously we should be connected to our heterosexual only partner. And they were both naked, but like they didn't even get embarrassed about it, even though they were like in front of nobody. So gotta ask you, is this story, is this take good enough for you? It seems to have been good enough for God, but it's not good enough for me, and I don't think it's good enough for you either.